Welcome to Decision Point. El Paso is a major gateway for human trafficking and prostitution in the United States. Fortunately, our guest today, John Martin, is dedicated to eradicating those issues here in this El Paso area. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here.
Well, I know that you have been in the business of helping people for many, many years. Your last position was with the Salvation Army, and now you're starting a new nonprofit that has a very particular focus. Is that right?
That is correct. In fact, I left the Salvation Army back in November of last year. And one of the main reasons being that I really wanted to focus on a project, or a program if you want to refer to it as such, that was desperately needed here in El Paso. And that is to work with victims of human trafficking, both adults as well as children.
Right. And so so this issue is a big issue in El Paso. Why would you single that out?
When you take a look at what we sort of generally refer to as the human trafficking market, why is there a market within El Paso? The first step that you need to look at is that we are a border metropolis. In fact, when I talk to several groups, both young and old, I remind them that we are one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world as we look at that. But take that out and say we are the largest gateway, because in all honesty, there's a lot of truth to that statement. This is not a new program. We're just trying to sort of formalize this. But when you look at the individuals that we have served over the past 7 years, because it started back in 2006, Ukraine, Russian, European, Asian, and Vietnamese, as an example.
So these are individuals who have been part of the human trafficking program here in El Paso?
That is correct.
Wow.
And so that's why I tend to tell people it's more of a gateway, in that there is the border itself, and there is the ease of crossing that border. So individuals may come into Mexico, as an example, and then are trafficked from Mexico to the north. I don't want to stereotype or to make any assumptions, because many of us seem to believe that it's either Mexico or Central America or Latin America as we work through it. Yes, we do have individuals from those locations, Honduras as an example, El Salvador, but again, it's a gateway as we come through.
And so what's happening with those individuals? Are they staying here in El Paso, or this is kind of a staging area and then they go elsewhere?
Actually, there's a lot of truth in the statement that you just said. When you talk to law enforcement here in El Paso, and I'm referring to federal, state, as well as local, because we've got a solid team of individuals that work together, they talk about two different types of domains, one of which is the domain of victimization. And many people, when I bring that up, I'll use Las Vegas as an example. We tend to think of Las Vegas as Sin City. But then I will actually surprise them a little bit, and I say, actually, Houston is worse. That is the domain of victimization. El Paso tends to be more of what we call a transit domain. So they're traveling through town to get from point A to point B. In some cases, they stay here, depending upon what type of victimization we're talking about. And so it is a transit point. Now that brings up the second reason why we have such a large human trafficking market here in El Paso. It's called Interstate Highway 10. Okay, you've got Interstate Highway 10 that goes from the west coast to the east coast. And what many people don't realize, and this was reflected in a report in 2006, I believe it was, from the Department of State, El Paso and Houston are considered to be two of the most intense areas of trafficking within the country, to the extent that 1 in 5, 20% of the victims nationally are expected to travel the I-10 corridor between El Paso and Houston. So you not only have the fact that we're on the border, but you also have I-10, which is that route of transport from east to west and vice versa. The third issue that really establishes this market, and this may surprise a lot of folks, it's Fort Bliss. Okay, with the violence that has occurred south of the border, travel south of the border is highly restricted to military personnel. In fact, it's been basically eliminated. Well, there was a sex tourism market in Juarez. Well, now, since they can't go to Juarez, the market has come to here. And that's what surprises a lot of people, because the military is predominantly men. And those are really the three key issues that we bring up every time we talk to folks that really makes this a prime area for human trafficking. And human trafficking, of course, does include the sex trafficking or the prostitution. But it also includes an old term just simply called slavery. forced servitude.
Can you give us an example of a scenario of victims that you've dealt with for each one of those?
One of the very first individuals that we dealt with, and we are able to tell her story, she's given us the permission to do so, is that she was actually approached by an individual that lived here in El Paso with the promise of work.
And she was in Juarez or somewhere? Or?
She was actually in Mexico.
Okay.
And she was in Juarez. And so they made arrangements through a coyote, which is smuggling, for the individual to cross the border. Once she crossed the border at that point, the promise of pay and everything else went away. So what became smuggling, which is a crime against the border, is now trafficking because she's being forced to work in that respect. She, in turn, worked for this family for several years, taking care of the children. As they worked through it, well, the children grew up. And at that point in time, the individual that brought her across attempted to sell her because she no longer had need of her.
Wow.
And that's when she got scared. She cried out, and she actually went to one of our partners, which was the Diocesan Migrant Refugee Services with the Catholic Church. And so once she contacted them at DMRS, that's what kicked in that whole realm of services. That same individual is still here in El Paso. She's now here legally. She's working. She has her own place. And that's what we are doing with the new Center of Hope, which is the new nonprofit that we want to establish. Because it's not just short-term care, but it's also long-term care.
And helping people get established and so forth in ways. So what about the whole issue of who's doing this trafficking? Is it cartels? Is it the mafia? Who's primarily behind this?
You would be surprised. I mean, it could be individuals that are simply out there for the cash. I think the latest report that I read is that human trafficking is the second or the third largest market in the world behind drug trafficking and guns, arms.
Wow.
Okay, in fact, I think it was estimated to be about a $32 billion, excuse me, let me say that one more time, $32 billion industry worldwide. So you have what I'm going to refer to as organizations or organized groups, and you have individuals that are involved. It could be simply somebody that lives in a nice house and needs a housekeeper, and the housekeeper is not necessarily there, okay, by choice at that point. Or it could be a large organization, more of a sex trafficking or prostitution related, that is bringing in a number of individuals. It can be a small business that is simply bringing in individuals to fulfill their needs, especially within the hospitality industry or the service industry. Nationwide, hotels are very well known for having problems of this nature. And so it does vary quite a bit as to, I guess you could say, who the perpetrator is or who is actually initiating the crime.
Right. Now, what about the victims? Are there victims of this type of thing here in the United States, or is it mostly people from third world countries?
Actually, it's a little bit of both. And I would say it's probably roughly an even split between that, because many times we look at foreign victims of human trafficking, but we also have domestic victims of human trafficking. A good example was a case that just recently came to conclusion here in El Paso. It was tied to Baltimore. I mean, that was the reach of that particular group. It was a man that enticed individuals to come into the music business. There was a house that was set up here in El Paso in a very affluent part of town in the Northwest, where the ladies were transported and then forced into prostitution and or stripping at some of the evening or the nightclubs that you have here in town.
And so when they're victimized like that, what happens to them if they don't get connected with some organization like yours or the Catholic Diocese? What happens to these people eventually?
Well, you have to look at the individuals first, okay? For it to be trafficking, one of three elements have to be proven, and that's going to be force, fraud, or coercion. So in many cases, these individuals, both young and old, are in fear. But in a lot of cases, you have what I'm going to refer to as that love factor, as you sort of pick it up. These are individuals. Let's look at a young girl run away from home. Whether it be her fault or the parents, it doesn't really matter at this point in time, but they're separated. She's looking for love, and the old saying, looking for love in all the wrong places, as you sort of pick it up. It's so they're looking for that father figure or somebody that's going to guide them through that. And they do take advantage of that, the predators too. So it may come across as love, but then all of a sudden they're being forced into a
Right.
different direction.
So if, for example, sort of disenfranchised or discouraged teenagers could potentially be victims of something like that. How do they find the victims?
Different ways. We've all seen what's in the media, but for example, the case that I just mentioned in Baltimore, believe it or not, they use social media and they use the internet.
Social media and the internet, huh?
Okay. The same is true in a particular case that happened in Juarez. You know, they'll get out through the media at that point in time that we've got work for you, just come on down. And so they respond, and then all of a sudden they're in a much different situation than what they anticipated at that point.
Now, if somebody, how do they keep someone who is from this country? I mean, you can understand people's fear of deportation or immigration and law enforcement from that standpoint, but how do these traffickers and people who ply the sex trade keep people here and in that kind of bondage without that kind of a threat of?
Well, there's different types of bondage. Okay. You mentioned one, the fear for, say, a foreign national that's coming in at this point in time. But when you look at domestic victims of human trafficking at that point, again, you go back into, not to overuse it, but that love factor. Okay. They've got nothing else to attach themselves to as they pick through it. There's also fear of physical abuse. Okay. You try to run. They catch you. What's going to happen at that point in time? Because in many cases, these types of operations are very mobile. They may be here in El Paso, but as soon as, say, a neighbor or somebody else brings attention to the matter, they can pick up and move within a matter of moments. And so what they do is they isolate the individual, typically little to no communication. And any communication they do have with the outside world is going to be monitored. They're going to be with somebody. We've used that Baltimore case, but there were several individuals that are referred to as bottom girls. Okay. These are individuals that help keep the other girls in line as you work through it. They're always with them. And so in turn, there is no communication. Cell phones are taken away. They're not allowed to write, even though I don't think anybody these days writes letters anymore, okay, as they sort of pick it up. And then, of course, the fear, and then the desire for the individual as the victim to be loved, to be wanted.
And even though it's distorted, nevertheless, it is something that feels like that to them, potentially, So you really, a lot of this comes down to, if it's not looking for work per se, kind of a counterfeit sense of seeking love, seeking a family, seeking authority, seeking guidance, and they get entrapped in these situations that they don't think that they can get out of in any way. So if we look at here in El Paso, then, is this something that the average person needs to be concerned about related to their children, or is this a problem that has to do with more of a transient underworld?
No, because I know I have a child. Okay. All children, just by their very nature, especially in the teenage areas, tend to be very rebellious. Okay. In fact, I'd be surprised if there isn't a teenager out there that hasn't threatened to run away. And so it does start with the family. And it starts with just honest communication about what's going on and as it works through it. But then that's where that domestic environment pops up. Whether they're upset with mom or dad, or maybe they have a rightful reason for leaving mom or dad at that point in time. Well, then they're out on the world on their own. And even though they may appear to be much more mature than what they are, they're still children. And they can be impacted in many different ways. And so domestic instances of slavery have been on the rise. And so it's something that it has to look at.
So why do you think that is? Because there are more runaways, or, I mean, more crime? I
couldn't tell you at this point in time, because I really don't have an answer for you as we sort of pick it up. But we continue to have the same problems, if you want to look through it. And with today's media, sometimes we tend to see more of it, more focused on it as we work through it. But I do know that if you take a look at the runaway statistics in the state of Texas, for example, it's in the thousands. Okay. And again, it's something that's a little bit under there. And those are the most vulnerable populations as we work through it.
The runaways and the
runaways,
broken families, so to speak,
as they work through it.
Now, you're really passionate about this, and how did you become so singly focused and enough to spend a tremendous amount of time pulling together this coalition, if you will?
Well, it started with my work with the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army is an incredible organization as they work through it, and that was really my first introduction. Okay, I started working with them in 2006, which coincidentally is about the same time frame that the Salvation Army had a grant with the Department of Justice to set up what we call the Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, which is a combination of victim service providers like the Salvation Army, as well as law enforcement, such as the FBI or Department of Homeland Security, whatever the case might be. And at that point in time, it was my introduction. And as with anything, I learned more as time went on at that point. And I realized the significance of the issue here in El Paso, and also the underground issues that are related to it, because what's inherent in all this is we do need to work with the victims. But in setting up this new organization, we also need to focus on outreach and education, such as what we're doing here today. Let people know that it does exist. Who can they contact if they have any concerns or questions? And also let them know, what are the signs? Okay, if you see somebody within your neighborhood, and what can you see? Is a child, for the most part, not going to school? When you see the child out playing, are they somewhat withdrawn? Some people may refer to it as shy, but maybe they're just scared of talking at that point. So outreach, as far as the general public goes, is very important. And then the training aspect of it with the service providers along with law enforcement is also critical as well. Because in many cases, when you work with law enforcement, they've got so much going on, and I've got nothing but compliments for them at this point. But you need to realize that, for example, with trafficking, it's a lot easier to prosecute a case as human smuggling, because you simply have to prove that they've crossed the border at that point. But with trafficking, you've got to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So in many cases, what is defined as smuggling is actually trafficking. And then that's a disservice to the victim. And we need to
Why is that a disservice to the victim?
Because there are certain inalienable rights to any individual, regardless of their country of origin. And if they are the victim, not the perpetrator of the crime, they should be treated as such.
So if it's human smuggling, then they're considered part of the crime, and if it's trafficking, they're considered the victim? Is that
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And then that opens up just so many doors for the individuals at that point. The ability to stay within the United States legally, because these are long-term cases. It takes time to get it through the courts. And so sometimes they're with us for a good year, if not longer, as we work through the individual cases. They have access to benefits, to health care, to Medicare. There's a number of co-occurring issues that come involved. I mean, especially with sex trafficking, typically you have alcohol and drugs involved, because they can use that as an influencing factor. Okay, get a young girl or a young boy hooked on cocaine as an example, and then you have that control mechanism, that chain at that point as you work through it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that a lot of people say is that prostitution is really a victimless crime. I mean, are a lot of the prostitutes forced into prostitution? Do they do it voluntarily? How does that dynamic work as you look at the whole issue of prostitution, especially since you said it's a big issue here because of Fort Bliss?
Right. I don't believe personally that it's a victimless crime, okay, because you have the individual themselves. And yes, there are some that will possibly go into this voluntarily at that point. They need to pay bills. And so you look at the economy as well, which we're just now starting to pick up at this point. But you also look at the individuals that are under the age of 18, because if they're a minor, they are a victim. Okay. In fact, you don't even have to prove force, fraud, or coercion if you're working with a minor in that particular area, because it's assumed at that point. And of course, so you have the individual, what happens to him or her, and a lot of times we tend to make the assumption that it's female, okay,
Right.
but that's not the case. It's both boys and girls, both men and women, depending upon what your perspective might be. So I strongly believe it's not a victimless crime. Yes, there are some that do it voluntarily, but it's also something that needs to be eliminated as far as a long-term goal.
So, but again, you say you don't believe it's a victimless crime. is prostitution just a matter of selling something to someone who wants to buy it, or does it actually impact the community in a broader way?
In my opinion, it does impact the community in a broader way. I mean, El Paso has got such a varied history. I remember one of the books that I read by one of my teachers in elementary school, Frost. It was on the history of prostitution in El Paso.
Never heard of that one.
It's actually a very interesting read as you sort of pick it up, because at one time, prostitution was actually legal in El Paso.
There you have
And I
it.
believe it was the early 1900s when the city leaders at that time said, no, we need to become civilized. And so in turn, what was once a highly regulated industry in El Paso is no longer. And then the problems that occur in conjunction with prostitution started to surface in dramatic numbers as we picked it up.
So, are you saying before, when it was legal, it was highly regulated?
At one time here in El Paso.
Yeah.
It's an interesting book. You need to read it sometime.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to pick that one up. So, would you say that that the regulation component was a deterrent, or a good thing, or a bad thing, or I mean, because I'm not sure what you were
I
saying there.
think it would be difficult for me to comment on history. I just thought that was sort of
Right.
an interesting anecdote as
Right.
you sort of pick it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you look at other countries where it is regulated and legal, for example, Scandinavia, the thing is that a lot of people don't get very excited about that issue because they don't look at it as something that is a victimization. They look at it as a choice that people are making personally in their lifestyle. But of course, from the scriptural standpoint and from a biblical standpoint, it's it's very problematic and really a thing that is so wrong, both for the prostitute, him or herself, and the person who's using them, then the whole infrastructure that goes along with it as well. And so from El Paso's standpoint, the trafficking and victimization and prostitution kind of go hand in hand. This is what you're saying.
In many respects, yes. Okay, and that's just seen through recent cases that we've seen here in El Paso. I've mentioned one before, and there have been several just within the past years. We talked a little bit prior to this interview about the situation that occurred in Juarez. Okay, it was a shelter for women. And the allegations, because I don't know whether or not it's gone through the court system at that point, is that men were actually coming to the shelter to solicit sex. And so here you have women, both adults and minors, that are being coerced into this business for fear that, hey, this is the only place I've got to live.
Right.
Where can I go from here if I say no?
Right, yeah. Now, you're with your organization, then you are working with and partnering with several other community organizations. You're not reinventing the wheel. Can you explain that briefly, how that's
Yes,
going to work? And your
it's-
Center for Hope?
Again, we're calling it the Paso del Norte Center for Hope, and one of the reasons I bring that up is that it's not just West Texas or El Paso County, it's also southern New Mexico. We work very closely with the folks at Doña Ana County, and of course we work very closely with the Mexican Consulate as well. So we're looking at it to be a regional focus. And I mentioned earlier that at one time there was what was called the task force, an anti-human trafficking task force. That was set up and funded through the Department of Justice between the years of 2006 and 2009. When that funding went away, those individuals that had come together underneath that task force, which again are law enforcement in conjunction with victim service providers, because it's a very successful model to have the two work together, everybody got together and they said, this is too important of a program to drop. So the task force at that time was renamed as the Working Group, which was a group of volunteer organizations and individuals that came together with the common purpose, and that's to assist victims of human trafficking, whether it be forced servitude or sex trafficking. So that group is still together. They're continued to be unfunded now, going on almost 4 years as we look through it. And they're having to scrounge and to beg and to plead to get everything they can. And so this program that was established, which by the way is considered to be a model program within the nation, as we pick it up, was done under the guidance of a young woman by the name of Virginia McCrimmon, who is the point of contact. She is still heavily involved. In fact, she's one of the key players. That working group is what has come together and says, yes, we agree. It's time that we have, and I'm going to refer to it more as an umbrella organization, not to duplicate services that are already being provided, but to act as more of a facilitator and a coordinator, to focus the outreach, to focus the training, and also be an entity that can raise funds so that we can have that staff on board, people such as Virginia, as well as another caseworker, or to provide services directly to the victims, whether it be shelter, housing, food, medical, dental, psychological. All of those are necessary ingredients as we put through it. And so it came together with the help of a new funding opportunity that we did apply for, and that was in partnership with Sheriff Richard Wiles in the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, which is a joint application that we hit the send button on just a couple weeks ago. Now, if we get that funding, fantastic, but we're not counting on it. What we want to do is to be able to set up that grassroots effort, raise the funds that are needed, so that it's the community that is responding to the needs of these individuals, not just one entity.
Right. Yeah. Well, that sounds very exciting, and we'll put the information up so that people can contact you if they're interested. Thank you so much, John, for coming and being with us today and telling us about this exciting, very, very necessary program.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to working together with you as well as the people of El Paso as we take the Center for Hope into reality.
Great. Okay, thank you. Do you think that these people are truly victims and need our help? Is your heart moved by the plight of the victims of sex trafficking and prostitution and all kinds of human trafficking? Is there even a small action that you can take to help? Let us know what you think on Facebook, Twitter, or our website at KSCE /Decision Point. Thank you so much for watching.